They bulldozed my grandfather's graveyard. Not part of it. Not a section accidentally encroached upon by some errant landscaping project. They took excavators and a monstrous, yellow bulldozer, the kind you see on industrial demolition sites, not in a quiet, tree-lined enclave where generations of our relatives had been laid to rest. And they systematically demolished every last headstone, every marker, every carefully tended plot, until nothing remained but churned earth and the obscene tracks of heavy machinery. This wasn't just land, it was his legacy, his solemn promise to those who came before. For years, that sacred patch, a small, privately owned cemetery, nestled surprisingly close to the creeping tendrils of suburbia, had been his quiet passion, a place of remembrance, he maintained, with a reverence that bordered on religious. He called it his grandfather's business, though it yielded no profit beyond the solace of continuity. And now, it was a scar, a wound gouged into the earth by a petty tyrant in a sun visor, the HOA president, a woman whose name, Brenda, or Karen Prime, as my cousin later dubbed her, would become synonymous with a particular brand of soulless, bureaucratic malevolence. She claimed, with the unshakable conviction of the truly delusional, that the graveyard didn't belong to him, that it was HOA common land ripe for development, for more beige boxes to house more compliant souls. This, despite a chain of title clearer than a freshly Windexed window, deeds and surveys stretching back over a century, all meticulously filed, all screaming his ownership. The illegality of it was breathtaking. A flagrant act of vandalism disguised as procedural necessity. We found out when grandfather, on his weekly visit with fresh flowers, simply stared at the devastation, the bouquet slipping from his numb fingers. The vibrant hues of the roses looked like drops of blood against the raw brown earth. That's when the cold, hard glint I hadn't seen in his eyes since grandmother passed returned, a chilling focus that promised a reckoning. The air itself seemed to drop several degrees around him. He didn't rage, didn't scream. He simply looked, and in that look, I saw the blueprint of a war he had no intention of losing. The casual cruelty of demolishing those graves, the sheer arrogance of it, had awakened something primal. The HOA, in its short-sighted greed, had just signed its own death warrant, though they wouldn't know it until the ink was dry and the foundations of their petty kingdom were dust. Grandfather wasn't a man of explosive outbursts. His anger was a slow-burning anthracite coal, radiating an intensity that could melt steel. He was ex-Corps of Engineers, a man who understood stress tolerances, load-bearing capacities, and the precise application of force. His grandfather's business hadn't just been tending graves. It had been a lifetime of building, of understanding how things were put together, and, implicitly, how they could be taken apart. This HOA, this Brenda, had mistaken his quiet dignity for weakness, his age for obsolescence. A fatal miscalculation. The initial shockwave that rippled through our family was swiftly replaced by a grim solidarity. His children, my aunts and uncles, their voices tight with fury, offered lawyers, public protests, media campaigns. Grandfather listened patiently, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the ruined landscape of his graveyard. He nodded, acknowledged their righteous anger, but I saw something else in his posture, a marshaling of internal resources, a quiet inventory of skills, honed in harsher crucibles than a suburban turf war. The bulldozed earth wasn't just an insult, it was a tactical affront. They had violated a sanctuary, and for him, that was akin to a declaration of war. He'd spent a lifetime respecting boundaries, both physical and moral. The HOA, with their excavator and their contempt, had crossed a line etched not in bylaws, but in bone and blood. I remembered him telling me stories, not of combat, but of impossible engineering feats in remote, hostile territories, bridges built under fire, airfields carved from virgin jungle. He had a mind that saw problems not as obstacles, but as complex equations, awaiting elegant, if sometimes forceful, solutions. The casual way Brenda had dismissed his ownership, the smug pronouncements about community enhancement while standing on the freshly demolished resting places of our relatives, echoed in the silence of our drive home that day. It wasn't just the loss of the graves, it was the effrontery, the absolute certainty of her power. He later retrieved the surveyor's stakes, bent and discarded by the bulldozer's tracks, and straightened them with a focused, almost ceremonial precision. Each tap of his hammer was a nail in the coffin of the HOA's hubris. He was methodically re-establishing his parameters, not just on paper, but in the iron of his will. Our initial response was deceptively conventional. We engaged a lawyer, a sharp young woman named Ms. Albright, whose initial disbelief at the HOA's audacity quickly hardened into a prosecutorial zeal. She pored over grandfather's impeccable documentation, the deeds, the plats, the historical records confirming the graveyard's continuous, private ownership. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on," she declared, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on a clause detailing explicit easements and boundary lines that even a child could understand. "This is grand larceny of real property, vandalism, desecration of graves. The list is extensive." But Brenda and her HOA board, buffered by their own legal mediocrity and an astonishing level of self-importance, stonewalled. They sent back smarmy letters citing non-existent covenants, misinterpretations of local ordinances so blatant they were almost comical, had the subject not been so deeply wounding. My cousin Liam, a cybersecurity analyst with a healthy distrust of authority and an almost preternatural talent for digital archaeology, became our unofficial intelligence officer. He wasn't so much a sidekick as a co-conspirator, his pale face illuminated by the glow of his multiple monitors as he delved into the HOA's murky digital footprint. "Bingo," he'd murmur, unearthing emails detailing Brenda's clandestine meetings with a developer, promises of expedited permits for new homes on the reclaimed land. The illegal demolition wasn't just an act of petty tyranny. It was a calculated step in a grimy little land grab. Liam compiled a dossier that painted a damning picture. Brenda, drunk on her minor power, leveraging the bulldozed graveyard for personal gain, or at least for the aggrandizement of her little fiefdom. He even found drone footage, posted proudly by the demolition company Brenda hired. Site Clearance Project, Willow Creek Estates Phase 2, showing their excavators meticulously tearing apart the old stone markers, the bulldozer then leveling the sacred ground where our relatives lay. The clinical efficiency of the destruction was a fresh stab to the gut. Grandfather watched the footage once, his face impassive. Then he nodded slowly. "They've provided excellent evidence of their methods," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "It will be useful." The battle lines were drawn, not just in the courts, but in the moral landscape of our community, where the silence of too many neighbors was a deafening complicity. The legal strategy Ms. Albright outlined was sound, a methodical siege designed to dismantle the HOA's defenses brick by bureaucratic brick. Injunctions, lawsuits, liens. But grandfather listened with a peculiar detachment, his gaze often drifting towards the window as if assessing wind direction or sighting along an invisible firing line. "They used a bulldozer," he said one evening, not to anyone in particular, his voice a low rumble. "A tool of creation, perverted for destruction." It was then I realized the legal battle, for him, was merely one theater of operations. He understood its necessity, the need for a public, sanctioned victory. But the deep, personal wound, The violation of something so sacred demanded a response that resonated on a more visceral level. His grandfather's business had always been about order, about respecting the finality of things, the sanctity of memory. The HOA had introduced chaos, had treated memory as disposable. This he could not abide. He began to spend hours in his workshop, a place usually filled with the scent of sawdust and oil, now strangely quiet. He wasn't building birdhouses or repairing old furniture. He was studying blueprints, not of houses, but of the HOA's own modest office building, a squat, unimpressive structure at the entrance to the development. Liam, using his digital wizardry, had procured them, along with utility schematics and county planning documents. They didn't know I was a cartographer in my youth, grandfather mused, tracing lines with a calloused finger, or that I understand how to deconstruct as well as construct. The meticulous planning was underway, a parallel operation running silent and deep beneath the surface of our legal maneuvers. There was a cold, surgical precision to his focus. He wasn't just angry, he was offended in an existential way. The illegality of their act was a given, but the moral transgression, the sheer, unadulterated hubris of demolishing those graves without a shred of due process or human decency, that was what fueled this chilling resolve. He started making quiet inquiries, leveraging old contacts from his engineering days. Men who knew where to procure heavy equipment without too many questions. Men who understood the language of tonnage and horsepower. The plan forming in his mind was audacious, almost unthinkable, yet possessed of a terrible, symmetrical justice. The acquisition of assets was handled with the discreet efficiency of a seasoned quartermaster. Grandfather, using a holding company that had been part of his legitimate grandfather's business for decades, a small land development firm that mostly lay dormant, placed an order, not for one bulldozer, but two, slightly smaller, more maneuverable than the behemoth that had desecrated his graveyard, but more than capable for the task at hand, and a compact excavator for precision work. Redundancy, he explained to me, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Always have a backup. Liam, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror, tracked the rentals, marveling at the untraceable layers of shell corporations grandfather had apparently maintained for just such a contingency. Or perhaps simply out of old habit from more volatile times. The deadpan nature of it all was surreal. Here was my octogenarian grandfather, a man who normally debated the merits of different rose varieties, now discussing the optimal approach vectors for demolishing a commercial structure. He surveyed the HOA office building with the intensity of a general planning an assault. He noted the access roads, the utility shutoffs, the load-bearing walls indicated on Liam's schematics. He even took soil samples from the periphery of their manicured lawn. "Stability!" he grunted, crumbling the dirt between his fingers. "Important to know what you're building on." Or unbuilding. His inner monologue, which he occasionally voiced in terse fragments, was a chilling blend of tactical assessment and moral philosophy. They took sacred ground, turned it into a prospective profit center. They violated trust, memory, and the law. An equivalent response is not just justified, it's required. The sight of those excavators tearing into the earth where his parents and grandparents lay, the image of the bulldozer grinding headstones into rubble, that was the fuel. He wasn't seeking mere revenge. He was seeking restoration, a rebalancing of cosmic scales that had been violently upended. He would remove the offending structure, the seat of their illegitimate power, and then he would rebuild. Not just any building, but a new sanctuary on their ground. The sheer, beautiful, terrifying symmetry of it was pure grandfather. He was calm, almost serene, the cold-blooded calm of a man who has made his peace with the necessities of his convictions. The emotional undercurrents were there, a deep ocean of grief and fury. But on the surface, there was only a steely, unwavering purpose. The night chosen for the operation was moonless, a thick blanket of cloud obscuring the stars, the kind of night that swallows sound and light. Grandfather, dressed in dark, practical clothing, moved with a surprising agility, the years seeming to fall away from him, replaced by the focused energy of his prime. Liam and I were relegated to a support role, observers mostly, tasked with documenting and, if necessary, creating diversions, though Grandfather's planning was so meticulous that seemed unlikely. The two rented bulldozers and the nimble excavator arrived on lowboy trailers, their drivers silent, professional figures who asked no questions and simply followed Grandfather's precise instructions for placement. There was a surreal beauty to the scene, the dark shapes of the machines against the faint ambient glow of the suburban night, engines idling with a soft, powerful thrum. Grandfather himself took the controls of the primary bulldozer. I saw him pause for a moment, his hand on the lever, his gaze fixed on the unassuming HOA office building. It looked so pathetic, so unworthy of the history it had tried to erase. Then, with a decisive movement, he engaged the transmission. The bulldozer lurched forward, its heavy blade biting into the manicured lawn, then the asphalt of the parking lot, heading directly for the front entrance. There were no warning shouts, no dramatic pronouncements, just the relentless, grinding advance of steel. The first impact was shockingly loud in the stillness, the sound of shattering glass and tortured metal. The front facade crumpled like paper. He didn't just ram it. He began a systematic demolishing, working with a practiced, almost surgical precision, taking down walls, collapsing the roof, reducing the structure to a pile of splintered wood, twisted metal, and shattered concrete. The second bulldozer worked in tandem, clearing debris, while the excavator was used for more delicate work around utility lines he'd identified earlier. The entire operation was conducted with a terrifying efficiency. It was not an act of blind rage, but a calculated, cold-blooded dismantling. The memory of his graveyard, of the violated graves of his relatives, was a silent, unwavering presence, guiding every movement, every decision. This wasn't just destruction, it was an erasure, a wiping clean of the slate so something new, something sacred could be built in its place. Dawn broke gray and drizzly, the light illuminating a scene of utter devastation where the HOA office had once stood. A jagged pile of rubble, neatly contained, was all that remained. Grandfather, smeared with dust and grease but standing tall, was calmly sipping coffee from a thermos when the first police cars arrived. Sirens wailing, lights flashing. Brenda was already there, a vision of sputtering, apoplectic rage, her face contorted, pointing a trembling finger at Grandfather and the still idling bulldozer. "Arrest him! He demolished our office! He's a maniac!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. The responding officers, a young patrolman and a seasoned sergeant, looked from Brenda to the rubble to my grandfather, who simply nodded a polite greeting. "Morning, officers," he said, his voice calm. "Quite a mess, isn't it?" Ms. Albright, our lawyer, arrived moments later, looking crisp and composed, a stark contrast to the chaos. She handed a thick binder to the sergeant. "Officer, my client, Mr. Henderson, has taken steps to rectify a grievous injustice," she began, her tone cool and professional. The structure that formerly occupied this site was, in effect, built upon a foundation of criminal activity and egregious fraud perpetrated by the HOA, specifically its president, Ms. Brenda Albright. She then laid out the evidence: the illegal demolition of Grandfather's graveyard, the forged documents the HOA had attempted to use to claim the land, the plans for redevelopment, Brenda's illicit dealings with developers. She presented grandfather's uncontestable title to his original land and, crucially, a newly filed, emergency-approved claim and survey map, legally transferring ownership of this precise parcel, the one under the HOA office, to grandfather, citing a little-known but valid colonial-era land reclamation statute tied to demonstrable, unrectified damages and loss of use of ancestral plots. It turned out the HOA office itself had been built encroaching on an old, forgotten public access easement tied to grandfather's original cemetery plot, an easement they had illegally extinguished. The excavators had not only demolished his history, they had trespassed in a way that gave him a unique legal opening. The sergeant, a man who looked like he'd seen everything, slowly paged through the documents, his expression shifting from incredulity to a grudging respect. Brenda was sputtering about calling the mayor, the governor, the National Guard. No one was listening. The initial shock among the gathering neighbors was palpable, but as Ms. Albright calmly explained the HOA's desecration of the historic graves, the mood began to shift from outrage at the destroyed office to a dawning understanding, even sympathy, for grandfather's extreme measures. The visual of the bulldozer next to the calm old man was a powerful statement. The work to transform the site of the demolished HOA office into a new sanctuary began almost immediately. The same excavators that had so recently been instruments of deconstruction were now employed with a reverent care, sculpting the earth, not tearing it. Grandfather, armed with his meticulously prepared plans, directed the operations. This wasn't just about replacing the lost graves. It was about creating a statement, a permanent testament to resilience and the enduring power of memory. He designed a small, elegant memorial graveyard, with a central monument detailing the history of the original cemetery and the circumstances of its rebirth. The legal framework Miss Albright had so brilliantly exploited held firm. The colonial statute, combined with the HOA's flagrant illegality in demolishing the original graveyard, and their own demonstrably faulty title to the land their office sat upon, created an unassailable position. The city, faced with a PR nightmare and incontrovertible evidence of the HOA's malfeasance, reluctantly approved the permits for the new cemetery. It was, as Ms. Albright dryly commented, an unorthodox solution to an outrageous provocation. Neighbors, who had once peered nervously from behind curtains, began to emerge. Some offered quiet words of support. Others, emboldened by grandfather's audacious stand, brought offerings, flowers, small stones, even offers to help with planting. The silent majority, it seemed, had found its voice, tired of Brenda's reign of petty tyranny. The symbolism was lost on no one. The seat of the HOA's power, the very building from which they had issued their edicts and plotted the destruction of his family's resting place, was now becoming a place of quiet contemplation, a new home for the memory of his relatives. Grandfather oversaw the installation of the first new markers, replicas of those that had been bulldozed, recreated from old photographs. There was a somber dignity to his movements, a profound sense of purpose. He wasn't just rebuilding a graveyard, he was reclaiming his grandfather's business, his role as a guardian of legacy, on terms that were unequivocally his own. The ground itself seemed to breathe easier, freed from the weight of the ugly little building that had defiled it. The public reckoning for Brenda and the complicit HOA board was swift and brutal. Ms. Albright, armed with Liam's dossier and the undeniable evidence of the bulldozed graveyard, initiated multiple civil suits. Simultaneously, the local prosecutor, under pressure from a suddenly engaged citizenry and a few council members who smelled blood in the water, and an opportunity to distance themselves from the HOA's stench, launched a criminal investigation into fraud, conspiracy, and the illegal destruction of property. The news media, initially drawn by the sensational story of a senior citizen demolishing an HOA office with a bulldozer, soon pivoted to the deeper narrative of injustice and corporate overreach. Brenda's carefully constructed facade of community leadership shattered. She was exposed as a venal, manipulative bully, her smug pronouncements now sounding like the ravings of a dethroned despot. Subpoenaed emails revealed her contempt for the residents she supposedly served, her plans to profit from the new homes built on the graves of my grandfather's relatives. The developer she'd been colluding with quickly distanced himself, leaving Brenda to face the fallout alone. The HOA board members, realizing their own culpability, began to resign in droves, issuing panicked statements of ignorance and regret. It was a rout. Grandfather, throughout it all, remained a figure of quiet strength. He gave one concise, dignified interview to a respected local journalist, outlining the facts, the history of his family's graveyard, and the HOA's refusal to acknowledge his rights. He never raised his voice, never resorted to invective. His calm articulation of the profound wrong done to him, juxtaposed with the image of his new, legally sanctioned graveyard rising from the ruins of their office, was far more powerful than any outburst. The court battles were almost a formality. The HOA's insurance refused to cover damages stemming from such blatant illegality, and they were forced into a humiliating settlement that included a public apology and substantial compensation, which grandfather immediately pledged to a fund for the preservation of historic local cemeteries. Brenda herself faced multiple charges and the complete ruin of her reputation. Her reign of terror was definitively over, demolished as thoroughly as she had demolished his sacred ground. The new graveyard stands today, a small, serene island of green amidst the suburban sprawl. A wrought iron fence, similar to the one that had enclosed the original, defines its perimeter, a clear boundary, a statement of defiance and ownership. A single solar-powered porch light, grandfather's touch, casts a gentle glow over the entrance at night, a symbol of vigilance and restored control. He visits daily, tending the new plantings, ensuring every marker is perfectly aligned. He sometimes brings a folding chair and simply sits, looking out over the stones that represent not just his relatives, but a victory hard won. The psychological closure is palpable. The act of demolishing their edifice and sanctifying the ground beneath it was a necessary catharsis, a way to reclaim not just land, but dignity. The blood, the moral cost of his actions, was weighed and accepted. He knew his response was extreme, but he also knew the provocation was a fundamental violation of everything he held sacred. His grandfather's business is now twofold: honoring the past in this new sanctuary, and serving as a quiet, potent reminder that some lines must never be crossed. The local authorities, after the initial uproar, have adopted a stance of benign neglect, perhaps recognizing the unique justice of the situation, or perhaps simply unwilling to tangle further with a man who so spectacularly demonstrated his resolve. The story has become a local legend, a cautionary tale for overzealous HOAs everywhere. "You won't believe what old man Henderson did when they bulldozed his family graves," people whisper, a note of awe in their voices. "He never sought to be a hero, only to protect what was his, what was right. But in doing so, he became something more, a reluctant warrior who, faced with the desecration of his ancestral graveyard by an illegal excavator-led demolition, responded not with despair, but with a bulldozer and an unshakable moral compass, rebuilding his legacy, quite literally, on the ruins of their arrogance." He ensured that the final resting place of his relatives would be respected, even if it meant moving heaven, earth, and an entire HOA office to do it.